You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am.
You know, my mug.
Yeah, but unlike Mika, you're not wrapped in some weird like shawl or.
No, instead I'm wearing a very bright red blazer.
They've gotten very informal, honestly. There on Morning
How's
Joe.
it? I haven't watched.
I honestly have not watched Morning Joe in like 8 years.
I want to wear a shawl,
but I just feel like I remember it just like
cool.
when it actually was finally revealed that they were like dating or whatever. Then it just felt like the quality of their, they just got more informal. But it was a terrible show before and after. So. I don't know why I even started that way, but nonetheless, here we are.
No, shaw's not included next time.
Yeah, well, it depends on what kind of shawl. If it's like a pashmina or something like that, I'd take a nice cashmere shawl. Anyway, long story short, here we are for the show, the Freedom Side. Plenty for you here today. As always, you're watching us here on YouTube, so this would be a good time to remind you that you should hit the subscribe button. And then also make sure you hit the bell so that you can get alerts about the things that you are subscribed to. And, wow, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Including, by the way, Rania Colleague's Dispatches, where there's a number of fantastic, many fantastic interviews that are coming out, including some in the upcoming days here. So you want to be on top of that. So hit subscribe, hit the bell. Rania, are there other things that you want our viewers to know?
Well, Eugene, if you appreciate our content here at Breakthrough News, I highly encourage those who are watching to become a Breakthrough News member by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, and you get to access exclusive content by becoming a member, including this wonderful mug that I'm like obsessed with. Sorry for the lipstick stain. Just pay no attention to that. It does not come with a lipstick stain.
No.
That's just my fault.
Yeah.
But fantastic mug, as well as other content, such as parts of my show Dispatches, as well as Eugene's monthly live stream, or a monthly special live stream on Africa. So yes, if you are able to, please become a member of Breakthrough News. You can also donate one time in the chat while you're watching. And yeah, I think right now, as I always say, and I'll keep saying it, independent media is more important than ever in this moment as we witness this horrific genocide in Gaza, and so the entire corporate media refuses to even call it that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny. I actually had not really reflected on that until just now. It is true, like almost all the media we consume of major Western media does not, in fact, call it a genocide whatsoever. And I mean, everything is so euphemistic. I think anyone who's active on social media these days, Rania, who is following the issue of Palestine, probably see people do this all the time where, they're like underlining different aspects of headlines and showing the use of like the passive voice, the fact that even if you say someone was murdered, you just will omit who did the murdering. All these different attempts in order to both sides thing. One of my favorites, if you will, Rania, is the old the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health or some variation of that. Like, we're going to give you this number, but while we give it to you, we're just going to let you know that it's probably fake. And if you believe the number, you love Hamas. I mean, it's like
what they're telling you.
It's such a loaded element. It's like building in this sense, and it's just interesting to me because there was that huge controversy over this, and then it was actually, in fact, resolved. The controversy was in fact resolved, that the numbers from the Gaza Ministry of Health are 100% legitimate. But
if anything, an undercount, because they can't count. They don't have the ability to count everybody under the rubble. Exactly.
Maybe as many as 7,000 people, by the way, according to the Euromed monitor, which is why if you look at numbers of dead, they say about 31,000. You might see 25, 26 other places, but some people are choosing to include, and I think rightfully so, the estimates of those who are under the rubble. But if we also include those who are injured, we're now actually over 100,000 people have been killed or wounded in some way.
Numbers.
I mean, it's
unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it really is. It's such a massacre that's going on.
And then you have someone like Brett Stevens in the op-ed section of the New York Times writing about why it's not a genocide. Meanwhile, a friend of mine that I was catching up with today told me she was sort of losing her mind because she saw the story about a baby who was 103 days old, like born on October 8th, I guess, and died at 103 days old. Like, imagine that was your life on Earth.
I know.
You're born into a genocide and you die cold, hungry, and surrounded by like hell. Yeah. It's just, I mean, and then you have people across the mainstream media who want to gaslight us that Israel is doing all it can to protect civilians. And does anyone actually believe that at this point? Like,
I honestly think that they don't. I just think it's one of these things that, like, what else are you gonna say? You know what I'm saying? It's sort of like you're what you've done is so terrible. You essentially you can't actually admit what you're doing because
Right.
it's that bad. So you just have to keep these, fictions going. But we want to get ready to get the show going and move on to one of our first stories. I will just add quickly for those of you who follow the show regularly, we've had Omar Badar, the Palestinian American analyst, on several times. He actually shared a powerful photo of the young, the baby, the infant, who was dead there after about 103 days. Which
And the baby, though, the other thing I'll mention about that baby is the baby had no family.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the family had been killed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just, you can't even wrap your head around how anybody could be like, oh yeah, well, Hamas.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care what Hamas did. I don't care what they did. I mean, you can lie about it. You can pretend it's real, whatever. It doesn't matter. There's nothing you could say that would justify a 103-day-old baby living under these conditions.
Yeah.
Nothing you could say.
Well, we want to turn our attention to another terrible crisis situation, and that is in Sudan, where there's a major conflict raging. And we are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Dr. Sidgi Kaballo, who is an economist and a Sudanese Communist Party leader. Dr. Kaballo, thank you so much for being with us. Oh, you might be muted. Oh, let's see here. It's our side. Oh, just trying to work on this here. See if we can hear you. Give us 1 second. We're going to work on that and bring the doctor back, who is a very long-time struggler there in Sudan. Very interested to see what he has to say. But, yeah, I mean, to continue the point, Rania, I think of what you're saying is, it can't be, it's one of these things that your parents tell you when you're a kid, in a way, like, two wrongs don't make a right. So whatever one may or may not feel about what took place on October 7th, that, in fact, is actually immaterial. And this is an issue that came up in the South African ICJ case, of course. This is one of the Israeli responses as well. This thing was done to us, so that we're just, responding. And many people have pointed out that the ICJ has, in fact, already addressed similar claims and stated that in fact doesn't fly. You can't just say, well, because something bad happened, we can then commit a genocide. But nonetheless, it still seems to be a major sort of talking point. The Bret Stephens article you mentioned was also, leaning very heavily on that sort of thing, which is just, I mean, there's just so many different elements to it. But, he was like, well, how come they don't say anything about, the Uyghurs in China? How come they're not saying anything about Syria? Blah, blah, blah. And it's hard to even address these things because there's so many different, distortions about those issues. But even if we just take it at face value, I mean, these are countries that have been brutally sanctioned, taken before the ICC. All these other different things have been done to them. So it doesn't even make sense on its own merits, because the concept that they're sort of putting out there is, well, South Africa doesn't care about any of these other issues, and these other countries are not being held accountable, and Israel's being singled out. But the fact is, these other countries are, to say held accountable is a little tricky, because I think sometimes they're accused of false things. But let's say you believe them, as Bret Stephens does. These countries are, in fact, not only being held accountable, but brutally punished for what's going on.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's actually less likely that Israel would be punished to the same degree, because, ultimately, at the end of the day, I think other countries will try to sanction Israel if the preliminary measures come out, but those countries aren't the United States. But it is the United States, the most powerful country, that is leading the charge to try to, kneecap the Chinese economy, strangle Syria to death. So it's such a logical fallacy, even on its own terms. It just gives you a sense of how morally weak the position is of these pro-genocide individuals.
Well, there's also the fact that, could you imagine if during the Holocaust, someone was like, look, I know that you're really upset about like Auschwitz and stuff, but didn't you see what's happening over there?
Yeah.
And you know what? Good point. We're really singling out Nazi Germany right now. Look at all the other horrible, like, it's just such a stupid,
sure.
like, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. Like, so don't worry about the genocide in Gaza because there's other violence in the world.
Right.
And wars. So just don't, it's just a stupid way to distract people.
Yeah.
It doesn't even make any sense.
Exactly. It's illogical on every possible frame. But I think the point you're making about distracting people is a key issue, because I do feel that to some degree, partially why Israel is so committed, for instance, to constantly relitigating what did or what did not happen on October 7th isn't because they really want people to believe it. They know people won't believe it. But if you create a big controversy controversy over it, then people aren't, focusing on this 103-day-old infant dying without any family around them, And I really do feel that it's almost like a strategy of chaos, and you miss things like, I assume it was from today. Someone shared it with me. It was from today. Maybe it was old because Likud has been saying this for a long time. But it appears that on I-24, Netanyahu said today that Israel must control all territory from the river to the sea. And I was like, oh, well, I thought that was genocide. So okay.
Well,
so
actually,
if a college student says that it's genocide.
Well, when they say it actually is, because what they mean by the river to the sea is very different than what Palestinians mean. What they mean by control by the river to the sea is move everybody who's not of the people we want here out and control anybody who's left, which is what is already the case. They already do control from the river to the sea.
They do.
They want to keep controlling it. And as long as that's their attitude, and it's going to be their attitude as long as Israel's a colonial settler state, as long as it's their attitude, there's always going to be people resisting them because no one in their right mind would submit to having their dignity and rights and land stripped away of them and living in destitution and at constant risk of having your home demolished and just being pushed out or killed arbitrarily. Nobody's going to submit to living like that.
Well, it's not just you saying that, Rania. Even Antony Blinken. Even Antony Blinken, who has, been facilitating this genocide from the very beginning in this American-Israeli war, allegedly told Netanyahu there is no military solution. Now, in a way, I wouldn't be surprised if he told him that because it's 100% obvious that is the case. But it was really just astonishing in many ways to think okay, so we're all agreed here. This is not actually going to solve anything. It's just going to genocide, massacre tens of thousands of people. So maybe we should just stop. Maybe we should just end the fighting right now. But nonetheless, this is being reported as this continues to go on. I believe the story went on to report that Netanyahu was just like, this, I don't really agree. I guess we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one, which also gives you a sense of all these U.S. I actually saw someone say this at the very beginning, maybe October 9th. I'm trying to remember who it was. It was a journalist. But they were like, just give it maybe 1 or 2 more days, and we're going to start getting an endless ream of stories about how the United States is secretly behind closed doors counseling Israel to end the war. And not only were they right that started, but it's every single day they're doing everything they can to distance themselves. And I guess I would be too, because who wants to be complicit in a genocide that you're actually complicit in? Of course you want to hide your tracks, but nonetheless, we're continuing to see that. But I also think, Ronnie, the flip side of that coin is the huge uprising of solidarity with Palestine.
Oh, yeah.
Is that they feel like they want to support this, but they know to be seen as supporting this will only become more and more untenable over time. And it seems to me like the U.S. administration is becoming a little bit more desperate to try to distance themselves from this, knowing especially the electoral fallout that could come from this year. But even their, close allies and friends have been deeply, aggrieved.
On the one hand, yes, but then you also have this crazy statement from the White House on the 100 days, marking 100 days of this genocide, where they didn't mention.
Excuse me, it wasn't marking 100 days of the genocide.
Well,
it was marking 100 days of the hostage crisis.
Yeah,
so they just ignored the genocide.
Didn't mention anything about Palestinians dead. Not a word. The whole thing was just about, for 100 days, Israeli hostages have lived in fear and terror. We will get them back. And it's wow.
Yeah.
Wow. But I guess, on the one hand, you're surprised. On the other hand, you're not. What more do you expect from an administration run by somebody who has repeatedly said he's an ardent Zionist? He believes in this. I know we like to make fun of Joe Biden, because he kind of is out of it and older and seems to fall asleep a lot and fumbles words and, sometimes he doesn't seem quite there. But I actually think he knows exactly what he's doing.
Yeah. He's one of the most consequential architects of U.S. politics for the past 40 years.
Yeah.
he was one of the most prominent senators. Everything from Israel to the war on drugs to, the Iraq war, which he was also for, by the way. Funny, one of those things that it's just amazing. Yeah, he knows exactly what he's doing. It's just like how he constantly repeats the lie that he was involved in the civil rights movement.
Yes.
You don't constantly repeat that you were involved in something that you definitely were not involved in unless you know exactly what you're doing. You're trying to create a fake image for black voters to think Joe Biden is a friend of black people because that's your political persona. So, I really feel, obviously, I agree with you. He's slowed down, but this is his politics. You know, I mean, this is who he is, as he said twice, actually, once in the 80s and then repeated again, I believe, when President Herzog was with him in the Oval Office. If there wasn't an Israel, we'd have to create one. And was on to say, because Israel is crucial to protecting American interests in the region. So talk about saying the quiet part out loud. The guy said it multiple times, as in the Senate, in the well of the Senate, and in the Oval Office of the White House. So for sure, he's lockstep with it. He's lockstep with it.
Well, you know, real quick before I say what I'm going to say in response to that, I do just need to. I can't help it, you guys. You know, you guys are used to this at this point. You're about to get finger wagged.
In trouble.
Well, look. It's fantastic. We have 816 people watching, but only 312 of you have hit the thumbs up like button. So I'm going to need that number to go up. If there's 816 watching, I want to see 816 likes. Okay, fine. Maybe that's a lot to ask for because probably like 100 people are hate watching us.
But if they're hate watching us, then they should just do the thumbs down.
Yeah, I know, but you can't. Sure, but you can't see the thumbs down.
Oh, okay.
I can't. So I don't know. Like I don't know if they've hit it. I have no way of measuring that.
Well, all you haters hitting the thumbs down, I guess. Thank you for engaging with us. Don't tell them. Maybe they wouldn't have known. Stop it, Eugene. I think that they would know. It's a giant thumbs up, thumbs down.
Well, I want to see like 600 likes.
Yeah.
If 863 people are watching. Ooh, that shot up. We're at 432.
It does.
It does help us in the algorithm. I do that because it helps us in the algorithm. It gets fed to other people's feeds because, you know, we're not CNN, so we don't just automatically get a boost.
Yeah, just for existing.
Yeah, just for existing.
Yeah.
But no, I think what we were saying about Biden's background, I mean, this is a committed American imperialist. We have to remember Israel is an arm of American imperialism, and it needs to be protected as a settler state so it can continue. If you're an American imperialist, you would feel that way. So it can continue to project U.S. power across the Middle East. And I say that just to just do some shameless self-promotion.
Please, do it.
My next episode of Dispatches is with Ali Qadri, who's a fantastic author and professor. I'm so excited for people to see that because he explains, I mean, I know we know that, but he really goes into like why this genocide in Gaza, in fact, does serve U.S. imperial interest as well as America's other wars in the Middle East. So all that's to say, I don't think we should dismiss Biden as, oh, he's just silly and dumb and old and dementia and all these things people like to say. I think we have to recognize that Biden is calling the shots. Biden is really okay with this. Biden does support this. I mean, maybe he doesn't like Netanyahu on a personal and political level because Netanyahu is basically a Republican. But that's just like, you know, a slight differences among the ruling class sort of situation. The end goal is the same.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I was looking for something here because I thought about the stat, but I couldn't remember the correct number. I mean, obviously we talk about the, you know, at least 31,000 dead, the 61,000 injured, but 69,700 homes completely destroyed. Nearly 2 million people, 1.9 million people displaced. 187,300 homes partially destroyed. 169 press headquarters destroyed, 320 damaged schools, 1,671 destroyed industrial facilities, 239 damaged mosques, 3 damaged churches, 637 health professionals killed or wounded, 183 healthcare facilities either, you know, destroyed or partially destroyed, 167 civil defense workers killed, 2,470 detainees forcibly disappeared, 198 heritage sites destroyed. I mean, it just, at a certain point, people are trying to debate whether or not this is a genocide. I mean, it's idiocy. I mean, this is mass destruction on a scale that I think is you know, except for a few other places in the world, Yemen especially, maybe Sudan, other places like that, maybe you can imagine it. But I think for the average person in most countries, certainly in the West, unimaginable. I mean, the vast majority, if you just imagine the vast majority of houses or apartments in your neighborhood just being destroyed or partially destroyed.
And that doesn't even come close to the number. That's what I was actually thinking about. I was thinking about like whenever there's wildfires and like a bunch of houses are destroyed, you think, oh my God, 15 houses were destroyed. That's 15 like that's 15 families.
Yes.
And you're talking about like tens of thousands here.
Yes.
Like
according to NPR, it's more than 60% of all homes destroyed.
That's just crazy. Or like think about your neighborhood and that your entire like street just being like blown up.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's what Israel's doing.
The Guardian said it's 33% of all buildings. So 1/3 of all buildings. Just like 1/3 of all buildings. I
It's so
mean,
crazy.
how could you possibly say that's proportionate? Or it just it boggles the mind, but it just shows that it's really not about the facts. It's about the ideological construction. I mean, this is you know really what Noam Chomsky meant by manufacturing consent, right? By creating the sort of structure by which you can have these totally insane conversations as if they're real by just having the right, the Hamas controlled health ministry. That you add all these little caveats, and it's just designed to kind of take the sting out of the reality of these statistics and create a framework by which someone can write a New York Times op-ed saying that this is definitely not a genocide.
It's also like worthy versus unworthy victims, which is another, thing that Noam Chomsky breaks down quite well in manufacturing consent. And in this situation, I mean, when you think about what we have become conditioned to be okay with in this country, like when you see the news, it's like, 700 people, 700 Arabs and Muslims and like Africans drowned in the Mediterranean on a ship. And people are like, wow, that's really tragic and sad. But, we're okay. Like, it's just okay.
Yeah.
But if like a cruise ship full of like a bunch of partying spring breakers were to drown, I don't think you'd have the same reaction.
No. Well, this is a good opportunity for us to segue into our next segment here as we continue our conversation about the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And we are very, very honored to be joined by Dr. Shahad Abu Salama, who is an activist and educator who grew up in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. Dr. Abu Salama, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. And I wish I joined you in better circumstances.
As do we, and we really appreciate you being willing to give us some of your time. And, here we are, we're just over 100 days into this genocide. You are someone who is from Gaza. So my first question away is I almost don't want to ask how it feels. It feels like such a cheap question, but, how are you, where are you seeing the conflict at this moment, just over 100 days in?
It is crystal clear. It's not a war. It is a genocide and a campaign of ethnic cleansing that Israel hasn't yet finished in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1987, the first Intifada, 2000, the second Intifada, and then frequent bombardments or acts of what Israel calls mowing the lawn since 2006, all of which I've lived with my people in Gaza. I was born and raised in Jabalia refugee camp that is now a death field, a killing field, in a death zone that has witnessed countless massacres so far, and that include my family, members of my extended family. I've lost so far over 40 members of my extended family, and we lost touch with so many. We just hope, we pray that they are somewhere safe, surviving. It's if you ask any Palestinian, but especially any Palestinian from Gaza, they would tell you they've never lived through more difficult times than this. We're seeing our Gaza, yes, it's an open air prison, but we made home from nothing there, and it is that we are internally displaced. We're part of the majority of Gaza population that are internally displaced, and I'm talking about before the genocide, all this started, and now the majority of the population, 2.3 million, of them, over 80% of people are displaced, and those include my family, who have had to flee 2 or 3 days after the genocide started from the north, which had become almost uninhabitable under severe bombing. It was the most severe at the time, that Al-Saftawi Street had become very dangerous. So they had to flee to Nusayrat refugee camp, where they spent a couple of months and then displaced again. And now they're in Rafah in a tent. In Rafah, they are in Rafah, southern Gaza, in a tent. My father, who's 72 years old, is in a tent. My brother, my youngest brother, who's a father of two toddlers, one is 5 years old and the second is 5 months old. She was born on my birthday. She was born on my birthday, 24th of August. And I thought that the world has given me, like, what a bliss that I've had my niece born on the same birthday as me. And I started fantasizing all the birthdays that we're going to celebrate together in the future. But I sincerely worry that my niece will not survive. And we're hearing of toddlers waking up, their parents waking up to them, freezing dead cold bodies because they're in tents in freezing cold weather. And you have to remember Gaza, some Israeli ministers tried to, like Mark Ragav in the UK here, a settler from Hungary who moved to Israel and has made his life mission facilitating the oppression of the Palestinians and legitimating it and justifying Israel's image and all that. He was saying that undermining the scenes of hundreds of men being stripped of their clothes, stripped of their dignity, humiliated, and put for the world to see. Israelis filmed them themselves after they've done this to so many men and boys, children. And he said that he tried to undermine the denigration of the Palestinian dignity that we've seen in those videos, and said that, oh, but you have to remember, this is Gaza, it's pleasant weather. No, that cannot, this crime against humanity, this humiliation, this indiscriminate oppression of people cannot pass with such a justification. It is dehumanizing. And for anybody to hear this, it is offending to our sensibilities, to our human feelings. It should be offensive to all of us, whether you have people there or not. This is not a justification, and the weather actually is freezing cold. In Rafah is closer to the Sinai side, and it has a weather like my brother says, it's like as if we're in Sinai. In the day it can be bearable, but at night they are freezing cold. They are literally freezing cold. And we're seeing more and more videos of parents holding their babies, dead cold bodies, who couldn't tolerate the freezing colds of nights in Gaza under heavy bombing. The tents do nothing, cannot help you from anything, from rain, from bombs, you're not safe anywhere. And also Israel is escalating its targeting of displaced people in tents in Rafah, as we've seen in the past days. So my family is not safe, and so is the majority of Palestinian families. And and my niece, who's only 5 months old, is very sick and cold, and we don't know what she's got, and there is no medical attention. The health system is destroyed. Israel has destroyed the health system as a way to destroy life in Gaza. I mean, like, that. How can people survive without a proper health system? And Israel is yet targeting systematically. And now we're worried that the same scenarios we've seen in Al-Shifa hospital, in the Indonesian hospital, in Kamal Adwan, in Al-Yaman al-Sa'id, in all hospitals of Gaza, Al-Awda, we're worried that we're going to see it again in Nasser Hospital, one of the last surviving hospitals in Gaza.
Dr. Abu Salama, I mean, I know that that's all really difficult for you to say. It's also incredibly difficult to hear. It's completely infuriating that this is being allowed to happen. It's being supported by our governments here in the West. And you've been very active in the diaspora to push back against this, as have Palestinians and Arabs and people who support this cause all around the world. And I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about what is happening on the ground. I mean, you're in London. There's been massive protests in London because people are devastated, heartbroken, and outraged by everything you just described. Then they're still coming out regularly in huge numbers. Do you see that the ground is shifting at all because of the mass mobilizations and organizing taking place in the belly of the beast, in the cities where the Western governments that are complicit in this disgusting genocide sit?
Yeah, thank you. And it's good to see you, Rania, by the way.
Good to see you as well.
I hope you're also coping.
Of course.
I mean, it is. I don't think. I don't know if I'm blessed, to be honest, to be in this country. I just run as far as possible from it. That's how I feel it.
I hear you.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible, but in the US, it's a similar scenario going on with the status quo, the government, despite millions in the street voicing the opposition to genocide and their persistent demand for ceasefire. The government is in denial of the realities suffered by the Palestinians, and they're still rejecting a ceasefire. I just don't understand how can you do that? How can you reject a ceasefire? A call for ceasefire, a call for protection of life, for a preventative measure of killing. How could you oppose like a value like this, a demand like this? I don't understand this. I think that this is genocidal, what they're doing. And it has passed the level of complicity. They're partners, mm-hmm. And they're even waging wars on behalf of Israel in the Red Sea against Yemen, against poor Yemen that has been vandalized and oppressed for over a decade with US and UK backing, and they are still, despite all the poverty and the famine we've heard about and everything they've struggled through in the past years, they have so much humanity to teach the world. they have so much to teach the world, really, about principles and what it means to stand in solidarity, and what it means to love for your brother, what to love for yourself. I'm just in awe for them, and yet those who are standing against genocide, who would say, they say it all the time, we would stop today if Israel stops the killing machine.
Exactly.
And yet the other side, the genocidal side, thinks that it is Yemen that is escalating the conflict, not them, who are avoiding, doing everything to avoid genocide. In terms of the change here, there has never been such an obvious gap between the people and the leadership. And I'm not sure if it's the same in the US, but I do see the mobilizations, and I do see all the attacks against the arms factories, and the multi-faith, multiracial protests that go every week. But also here, we've got amazing people's mobilization. And they want us to believe, they think that we can have such a short memory that they have, that brings history back to 7th of October. But we remember when we were in the streets in 2021, in 2014, and before, you were on the streets on our behalf when we were being killed and terrorized in Gaza. And we can't forget this. We can't accept their dehumanizing narrative that is built on denial, that is built on protecting a regime of apartheid that has been condemned by apartheid, not just by international organizations, human rights organizations, but even Israeli organizations have, like B'Tselem, have acknowledged the gruesome reality of the Israeli regime. And this is before any of this started. And you could even argue that the siege in itself, the fact that Israel was posting about putting the people on diet through the siege, and just mowing the lawn with its frequent bombardments of Gaza. All those statements that we've heard, and during the Great March of Return, when we saw people going in their tens of thousands, families, young people, elderlies, all going peacefully, just to call for the right of return. And the prime ministers of Israel and all of the political status quo, they were repeating the same thing, that basically there are no civilians in Gaza. There are no civilians in Gaza in their eyes. I mean, like, somebody that if these statements existed before this, then genocide, in the intention to genocide, and really the red flag should have been triggered long before we got to this stage. But here we are in this stage, facing the most brutal high-tech genocide and ethnic cleansing in modern history, on live TV, broadcasted to whole world on live TV, and with immunity. It's despicable, and we all have to take responsibility for this.
Well, we really appreciate you being willing to join us and help sort through all of this. Dr. Shahad Abu Salama, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
I mean, I was holding back tears hearing those stories. That is really, I mean, you know all that's happening. It's just the amount of intentional suffering being inflicted on babies is just so. I mean, can you imagine? Like, imagine just being cold and stuck outside for like a couple hours because you went to a protest and didn't wear enough layers. I'm not saying that happened to me. I'm just saying it happens to me. But you know, like, think about when that happens, like when you're stuck outside and it's really, really cold and you just didn't wear enough clothes and it's really uncomfortable, but you know, it'll be over. You're just kind of like, okay, it's really cold, but it'll be over in like, just 2 hours. I got to just endure this for 2 hours and it's over. Night after night after night, children are having to endure temperatures that can kill them. With no end in sight. Like, not just, one more night, not just make it until this day. Like, there's not even an end in sight. It's just day after day after day. You can't even tell yourself, just make it a little bit longer because you're almost at the end, because you don't know if you are. And as an adult, it's hard to endure cold for a couple hours. Imagine babies who already don't have enough to eat. Their immune systems are already shot. They've survived 100 days or plus of genocide. They're surrounded by disease. There's no toilet to use. There's pregnant women. Like, when you're pregnant, you have to drink a lot of water. And there's pregnant women who everybody's getting just a little bit of water a day. If they're lucky, every day is kind of like a hunt for water and food. In these places, like, where all these people are just like trapped like sardines in these so-called evacuation zones, where there's tents, just completely exposed to all the elements. It's so cold. And on top of that, like, you say you're 5 months pregnant and you're like drinking a little bit of water here and there when you get it. You're not really eating. Like, if your baby even survives to term, imagine the consequences of that down the line, the developmental. There's just, the consequences of this are already so severe, and it's going to continue, but this is disgusting. You have people justifying putting people through that. Like, what is wrong with people? Seriously, what is wrong with people? Like, I know logically, yes, but I'm still just completely stunned. I can't imagine ever looking at pregnant women or babies or toddlers or adults anywhere in the world and saying, yeah, that really sucks, but Hamas, or but this. Like, it's just completely insane.
Indeed. Well, now we want to turn our attention to Yemen, where last night, by the way, if you missed it, there was another round of U.S. airstrikes on Yemen, and we are very, very honored to be joined here by Yousef Mawry, who's a journalist and a political analyst based in Yemen. Yousef, thank you so much for being with us here on the show. Oh, can you hear us?
Oh, we can't hear him.
Oh, maybe we can't hear us.
We can see him.
We can see you.
You look great.
Indeed. Okay, we're going to work on that there. Have Yousef back with us.
It's when it comes to technical issues, it's either all of it at once. It's either super. Oh, there we go. Nope, no, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong screen.
Yeah.
There we don't go.
Yeah, there it is. Well, anyway, that's true. There we don't go. But no, we'll figure this out, and we'll get it figured out here as it concerns, obviously, another major hotspot in the context of this broader genocidal campaign going on, which just keeps being expanded rather than actually addressed, which I think is one of the just amazing things, is that almost all of the negativity that's being put out, well, this person's doing this country's doing this, people taking action to try to stop a genocide, and it's like, how dare they do anything? But they're not saying the US, the UK, we should just stop the genocide, and all these other things that we're denouncing would actually stop. It's very clear, it's very logical, and yet and still, the war just keeps being expanded by those who want to facilitate this. And of course, we're still on the verge, of the possibility of sending $14 billion to help them continue the war in addition to whatever we've done. I noticed that the exact number is now eluding me. But anyway, there's more and more weapons flowing in. There's all these things happening. They're bypassing Congress to send weapons to bomb Yemen. I mean, so, whether or not, I mean, obviously Congress would let them do it. But, just like the kind of brazen lawlessness of the whole thing is really quite something to witness and really the level of complicity. But, I think this is partially why you see so much vitriol directed by these same individuals towards the South African ICJ case, because if they are able to prevail, all of these people, Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, others will be complicit. And in some ways, it won't matter in the United States, but in countries like Spain and the UK that have universal jurisdiction, people can bring cases against them. It's obviously happened with Pinochet. And actually, Donald Rumsfeld, this was something that happened to him where he couldn't even really travel because there were so many countries that, were holding him accountable for war crimes in Iraq. I think he couldn't travel to Europe for years. But I think we have Yousef back with us, Yousef Mawry, who's a journalist and political analyst based in Yemen. Yousef, thanks so much for joining us.
I hear something, but I don't know what it is. Do you hear that?
It may be him speaking, but
he looks frozen though.
Yeah, it might be frozen on our end.
Thank you guys for having me. It's good to be here.
Oh, perfect.
We
got you now.
We got him.
Well, Yousef, let me start here. Last night, another round 14 at the different sites attacked by.
Can you guys hear me?
Oh, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Hey, can you hear us?
Hello.
Hello. Do you have us? Yousef, can you hear us? Huh.
Yep.
Looks like we're having some weird technical issues. We heard you perfectly.
It came through for like a second and suddenly.
Yeah, I would think there was a little bit of a delay, so I don't know if that was also affecting us. Well, we'll try to get that figured out. Obviously, we want to be able to, hear directly on the ground what is happening in Yemen, which, of course, is something that you don't hear a lot about. I mean, I think that's kind of the par for the course with how these issues is reported. Is one of the things we've pointed out in many different parts of the world, Rania, is you hear more about it from people who aren't there than from people who are there. I mean, whether we're talking about Haiti, whether we're talking about Yemen, whether we're talking about the Horn of Africa, whether we're talking about, quite frankly, the places in the United States of America.
Yeah, so do you think there's a correlation between being targeted by imperialism and shoddy internet?
Yeah, well,
is that where you're going with this?
Yeah, certainly is there is certainly a correlation in that, and certainly the provision of services in Yemen, like many countries, a lot of these things have been just totally eviscerated. These basic public services. Obviously, we're seeing that in Gaza. I mean, and I think that's one of the elements of this war in Gaza that I feel has also been revealed to us is the importance and the power of having access to the internet from the point of view of just like the access to information as being a form of human right, access to information, communication, all these things that we all have started to take for granted, quite frankly, because there's so many devices around us all the time, and how sinister it really was. I think each time they did it, but the first time where it was like, we're going to cut off all of their communication and then like double down on our bombing. And I feel that, I don't know, just something I felt was brought into really full relief, the importance of recognizing access to information really as a human right, and these private companies who control, where we're speaking to you from right now, in addition to everything else, really, really should not. Okay, I think.
We're going to try this again.
I think we are going to try this again, see if we can bring Yousef on here.
You guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes, yep, I can hear you, but I think there was a big delay in the previous attempt.
Okay. Well, we got you now, and we really appreciate you joining us here. My first question for you, another round of U.S. airstrikes on Yemen last night. What has the impact of these been on the Yemeni people? How are people feeling after having been attacked by the United States yet again?
Well, I actually just came back from a wedding, and in fact, there was a lot of weddings here today in the capital, Sana'a. People were just going about daily life as they've experienced this before. 8 years of war led by the Saudi-led coalition. The Yemeni people, they've endured all types of crimes, atrocities, ranging from there's a quarter or a third of a million bombs that were dropped on the Yemeni people in 8 years of war. Not to mention, Yemen was considered the world's worst humanitarian crisis because of a a blockade unlike any of its kind in modern day history. There was basically no food, no medical supplies, no basic essentials that were allowed into Yemen for 8 years straight. So I think the Yemeni people, they've experienced nature. Excuse me. They've experienced the nature of war. They've experienced the nature of hardship. They've went through all the challenges. I remember, during the Saudi-led coalition war here on Yemen, it got so bad that there was no cooking gas for the people. They didn't have a source of energy to heat food. So what they started doing is they started logging. They started cutting all the trees, all the branches, all the wood that they can find. And then once those ran out, people actually started burning garbage as a source of energy to heat their food. So despite that, those atrocities, despite that, the inhumane aggression on the Yemeni people for 8 years, the Yemeni people still went about their lives. They have weddings every Thursday and Friday in Yemen across the country. And like I said, I just came back from a wedding, and actually they were listening to the breaking news of U.S. airstrikes continuing on Yemen, and they, once they heard that breaking news, they did what they usually do. They chanted anti-U.S. and anti-Israeli slogans. So. And just based on just to go based on what the Yemeni people are saying on the ground, right, including the Ansar Allah officials, they consider it. People don't understand the Ansar Allah and the supporters, the Yemeni people. They view this conflict with the U.S. as a historic, holy conflict because they believe U.S. represents the axis of evil across the world. And the Ansar Allah leader last week, he mentioned and he stated very clearly that the Yemeni people are honored to be at the forefront of this conflict against the US, against who they refer to as the Great Satan, because they believe that sooner or later it's either the free world or the Western hegemonic neo-colonial world domination that has existed in Yemen and across the Middle East for many, many decades now. So yes, the Yemeni people are, they're prepared. They've been through this before. And when we're talking about the military preparations that are undergoing on the ground, there's a lot of that happening. I don't know if you guys heard the speech today by the Ansar Allah leader, Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi. He basically said, the Yemeni people or the Yemeni army is continuing to develop weapons that the enemies of Yemen have not yet witnessed. And they're doing this in the midst of a blockade. They're doing this in the midst of US British military airstrikes on Yemen. And the message by the Ansar Allah leader to the US and to its partners is tread carefully, because the Yemeni people, he basically said this. He said that the Yemeni people are a nation of mujahideen, that the Yemeni people are a nation of people who don't mind going to war if the cause is right, if it is for a good and just reason, which they believe that is the case. They believe, and I don't want to give you guys the opportunity to some questions at me, but they believe that this is a moral and humanitarian obligation to stand with the people of Palestine, essentially and ultimately to end the genocide that is happening. At the end of your previous guest, and she was very emotional explaining the situation that's happening on the ground, and that's the human nature. That's the goodness that exists in all, or if not most, of human beings. So it's sad that the people of the free world cannot enact the good nature of the human morality by ending the genocide in Palestine, because we're being forced to continue witnessing genocide. For any moral, decent human being, that's not something that they can have a hard time sleeping at night thinking about it. That genocide is actually happening in 2024, and there's nothing we can do about it. So the revolution here in Yemen that was led by the Ansar Allah movement, it prioritizes, according to the Ansar Allah officials, it prioritizes bringing an end to Western injustice, not just in Yemen, but throughout the Middle East and throughout the Muslim world?
You know, Yousef, I think it's you said a bunch of really important things I'd like you to elaborate on, mostly in the context of after the U.S. and the British, with help, I think, from like the Netherlands and a handful of other countries, bombed Yemen. They did it twice, right? The reaction, I mean, first of all, the media in the U.S., as I'm sure you know, portrays Ansar Allah as some like rebel group that is not in charge of Yemen. They constantly just call it like Iran-backed like militia, basically, when actually it controls the majority of the country after this very, very long war. But there are other political factions. A few of them were actually backed by the U.S., by the Saudis, who after the U.S. bombed, many of the leadership of those factions came forward and said, well, forget this. We're now just going to be on the side of Ansar Allah in this war. So I'm just curious if you could talk a bit about how the U.S. bombing Yemen last week actually solidified Ansar Allah's support across the country and basically has people not deterred as the U.S. perceives it to be, like we're bombing you to deter you, but actually... Did we just lose him?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, you're still here.
The
I know what that's like. No, I hear you. I live in Lebanon most of the time. That happens to me too. But basically, where I'm getting at is, could you talk a bit about how this has solidified support for Ansar Allah and actually support across the country for this humanitarian blockade they've inflicted in the Red Sea on ships destined for Israel?
Yeah, so I think witnessing the massive support that the Ansar Allah movement has received, and I think that's mainly because of their hegemonic order or domination in Yemen and throughout the Middle East. You mentioned the what's all this commotion about the Houthis, Ansar Allah? Is it the Yemeni army? There's this narrative that's being parroted, obviously, by mainstream media, trying to structure the group, this Iranian-backed militia named the Houthis. The Houthis is a Yemeni tribe that have existed in Yemen for over 8 centuries, 800 years. They have a long history, scholarly history in Yemen and influence in Yemen, way before there was the establishment of the Iranian Revolution, way before the Iranian government ever existed, right? So I think it's to frame the Ansar Allah movement as a Houthi militias, rebels who are hell bent on bringing chaos and destruction to the world. I think that's really, really a poor and lazy way of trying to say that this is the new boogeyman. This is the new terror group that poses an imminent threat to the rest of the world, when in reality, what's happening on the ground is that people are starting to see what this Ansar Allah movement represents, what it stands for, and if what they stand for is represented and reflected upon the actions that they are undertaking, right? So when they say they stand for injustice and they stand against Western imperialism in the Muslim world, they have to follow that with action. And we see that action enacted in Yemen. They were successful in ultimately eliminating and toppling the regime of the forces, all of the factions that existed in Yemen that were loyal to the US, they were loyal to Saudi Arabia, they were loyal to the Emirates, and of course the British government. These Western nations, the way they controlled Yemen was by installing puppet factions, and all of them were fighting for a bigger slice of the pie, not to serve the Yemeni people, but rather to serve their sponsors, the U.S. and other Western powers. So when the Ansar Allah movement, since their inception, they said enough is enough. Yemen has to be a sovereign, independent nation, and it cannot be a country, a proxy state, an extension of Western hegemonic order in the East. So the revolution happened. Obviously, I'm not going to go back into history because that would take all day. Their revolution was successful, and as soon as they succeeded in their revolution, toppling the previous U.S.-backed government forces, They then went to war for 8 years with a Saudi-led coalition. Obviously, Saudi Arabia, the coalition, they lost the war, and in return, the Ansar Allah movement, they've strengthened their grip in power. They gathered more support, and they developed a more ballistic missile system, which Yemen never even possessed. In fact, the weapons that the Ansar Allah movement has today, as a result of the 8 years of war, is perhaps the most powerful weapons possessed in the entire region. So when we're talking about the support of the Ansar Allah movement, it's because what they are representing is freedom and liberty from the shackles of Western interests and Western servitude. And I think that's clearly demonstrated when you have massive support worldwide, basically praising their efforts in terms of blocking Israeli ships from targeting the from passing Bab el-Mandeb, blocking Israeli ships from crossing the Red Sea. And I'm getting into that. All of this effort is not going to benefit Yemen, and it's not going. Yemenis are not benefiting. The Ansar Allah movement is not going to benefit any worldly gains by going to war with Israel or going to war with the U.S. But they feel that it is a religious, moral, and human obligation to bring an end to suffering and genocide taking place in Palestine.
One other thing I wanted to ask you, the U.S. is sort of threatening to bring back the designation of Ansar Allah as a terrorist organization. Now, of course, we know that those sorts of designations are used to tighten the humanitarian noose, if you will, around a population. Talk about perhaps maybe that prior to the lifting of the designation and whether or not there's any expectation of if that designation is placed back on Yemen and having a big impact in terms of the daily lives of individuals.
I think they've already been designated as a terrorist organization, and I think it's going to officially take effect in 30 days. And I think the reason why the Biden administration is giving that leeway of 30 days is because they think that perhaps the Ansar Allah movement, the Yemeni army, is probably going to, they think that fear is eventually going to set in with the Ansar Allah movement, because guess what? You're going against the most powerful nation, not just in the world, but in history. Do you really want the U.S. to go to war with you? It's this image that the U.S. has curated over years of military occupation and military, super power that has spilt blood, chaos, and trails of blood across the world. We've seen what they did in Japan with the dropping of the atomic bomb. So the U.S. went to all these wars. They caused all this bloodshed and chaos because they want to establish a firm position in the world, and they want the entire world to know that they are the most powerful nation in the world, and don't you dare go to war with us, because what happened in Iraq will happen to your nation. What happened in Afghanistan will happen to you. Forgetting the fact that the Yemeni people, it's a set of principles, I guess you can say, because when we're talking about going to war with Yemen, Yemenis are not going to war, to serve, a certain political system or a certain leader. They're going to war because they believe that it is a religious obligation. Yemenis are very, very intact with the Islamic religion. They hold dearly to Islam, and they believe that fighting in the path to rid people from oppression is an act that will ultimately grant them the ultimate price, which is entrance to heaven. This is the ideological, philosophical approach by the Ansar Allah movement. So, the strongest bond that any group of people can have is not the blood bond. It's really the ideological bond, a set of ideals and concepts that forms a society that fights and struggles for a common goal or a common cause. And I think the Yemeni people in the parts that are under the control of Ansar Allah, along with all of the military units and the government, I think that notion and that concept exists through all the three elements: the people, the army, and the government. I think all of these elements and aspects are in harmony with one another, which is why we don't see a lot of opposition these days, considering the wars that they waged against the Ansar Allah movement. We have, as you mentioned, Rihanna, we have even opposing parties to Ansar Allah basically declaring their support, not because they like the Ansar Allah movement, not because they think the vision of Ansar Allah is the best vision for Yemen, but because they feel that what they are doing in terms of trying to alleviate the suffering in Palestine is a righteous cause. So they're joining forces under that umbrella.
Well, we really appreciate you being willing to join us from there on the ground in Yemen and help us sort through all of this. Yousef Mawry, journalist and political analyst, thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Well, that was fantastic. It was great to
Yes.
hear from somebody who's actually based inside Yemen and,
Yes.
not some like white expert who has a PhD in some anthropological spook thing.
Yes.
in
Yes,
this one
yes.
rural village in Yemen. No, that was really such an important and informative interview.
Yeah, and I think we probably are tagging Yousef on our social media accounts. We certainly will when we share the clip. You can follow him on X. I'm not on Instagram, but he may be there as well, giving very frequent reports about what's happening from there in Yemen. A coterie of journalists who are actually using social media to report a lot from there on the ground, which we need to hear, quite frankly. So really thank him. And I don't know what time it is over there, but I really appreciate folks staying up late to be a part of this show.
Speaking of folks staying up late, I think that
Yes, we do.
our
We have
next
Dr.
guest-
Anis Germany, Lebanese medical doctor and public health researcher, joining us to discuss the germ warfare aspect. I don't know what else to call it, Rania, of what's taking place there in Gaza.
There's Anis.
Hi, Anis. Thanks so much for being with us.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Well, really an honor to have you and to have you back. Of course, great episode of Rania Colleagues Dispatches, which you were also a part of. But maybe for those who didn't see that and who have only seen sort of the headline that disease is stalking Gaza, maybe just give us maybe a capsule view of the impact that disease is having on those who are still trapped in the Gaza Strip.
Well, in terms of the infectious disease profile that's happening in Gaza, it is an absolute disaster. And it is not an unexpected result, considering that Israel is purposefully targeting any kind of healthcare facility. A couple of days ago, the Ministry of Public Health of Gaza said that they only have 6 ambulances left. And people can just imagine what that means in terms of the healthcare system being able to go to people who are in need of aid. And they started off with 70 ambulances. Now they're down to 6. These ambulances are barely functional because there's no gas being allowed into Gaza. People are cramped. Millions of people cramped in the south of Gaza. This is a recipe for any kind of infectious disease. And I think your viewers would understand. So if one of their parents or their family members gets sick, eventually a week or 2 later, they will develop the same sickness, whether it is the flu or something even more dangerous. I think around today, the Ministry of Health counted around 8,000 cases of hepatitis A. This is a disease that is contracted due to poor sewage. Already we know that there is around 500 people that are using the same bathroom in Gaza, in the south of Gaza, only in the quote-unquote safe zones. These are the spaces that are under the protection of the UN, that Israel bombs at will, attacks at will, has no respect for them at all. So considering that one bathroom is being shared by 500 people, we can definitely imagine how many diseases are being contracted. And it is not a question, I have to say this because of the racist statements that are coming out of Israeli officials, but it is not a question of individual hygiene. It is a question of the environment in which these people are forced to live under. No person can afford to have their own personal hygiene or the certain standards of personal hygiene in the conditions in which people in Gaza are living today.
They don't have water to drink. They certainly don't have water to wash their hands or shower in. I mean, people are going, I don't know, there's people who haven't showered since this started except to go jump into the sea. Mm-hmm. It's utterly shocking. Anis, I'm curious can you put this in the perspective of, it's horrifying. Obviously, this is genocidal, but it's also a pattern in terms of what a colonizer does to the colonized. I mean, this sort of, what did you call it, germ warfare?
Yeah.
It's not new. Using disease to try to kill more people off. Can you talk about that aspect of it and also maybe touch on the fact that when we talk about people being exposed to all kinds of diseases under these conditions, we're also talking about people who already have compromised immune systems because for 100 days they haven't had regular access to the necessities of survival.
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea of biowarfare is not a new concept. It is definitely something that is taken out of the colonial book. I mean, I'm assuming both of you guys are in the US, you understand the US history, and we know very well that the colonizers, gave indigenous populations there these sheets that were infected with these viruses that came from Europe, and the indigenous population in the Americas was not used to these viruses. Their immune system were not accustomed to them, and therefore this is what caused major casualties in the millions. Whereas colonizers actively killed a couple thousand, the millions of deaths were because of disease. This contact of a foreign infectious agent to this indigenous population. Differently, though, in Gaza, what's happening today is that with the knowledge that we have today, with the advances in medicine and in science that we have today, and with globalization, despite all of these facts, today Gaza is a completely insular environment. So all the electricity is given by Israel, the water, the food, the humanitarian aid, the lab tests, the medication, everything. And we've seen it. And it's the proof to that fact is when the Israeli authorities decided to seal off Gaza completely, it happened overnight, which is unachievable unless you have full control of the area. And ever since then, we've seen them promote all of the necessary ingredients to create this disastrous recipe of promoting infectious diseases in Gaza. We've already, the Ministry of Public Health already counted thousands of cases, hundreds of thousands of cases of respiratory diseases, gastrointestinal infections. And it doesn't take a scientist or an expert to know that when you cramp a lot of people in a very small area, these people have been bombed, they are homeless, they haven't been fed for more than 3 months, they don't have access to their medication. Eventually, these people will develop a series of infectious diseases, and people with chronic diseases, their conditions will start to decompensate. So when you do not have access to clean, drinkable water, there's some reports that a lot of Palestinians have resorted to drinking seawater and drinking water from agricultural wells. So if you already have, let's say, chronic kidney disease, and around 1,000 people in Gaza were counted as people suffering from chronic kidney disease, these people haven't had access to dialysis, to their chronic medication. And on top of it, you are drinking water that is polluted with heavy metals, with a high concentration of salts. All of this will accumulate in the kidneys. It will exacerbate this condition. People with cardiovascular disease who need to be on anticoagulants on a daily basis haven't had access to this medication. Women who are pregnant, these women need access to supplements. They need access to improved dietary intake. They need regular checkups for the ultrasounds. I mean, anything that we take for granted as people living in a regular society, they have no access to it. And there is no example that we can take from history, because in that sense, it is exceptional, because it is not a population that doesn't know their health requirements. It is not a population that out of their own hands, they cannot afford to have access to these things anymore. This is being purposefully created and inflicted on a population by another one. And in that sense, we cannot truly predict. I mean, so far there have been some predictions, and I think they might be even worse, that around 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza will die within the year. And that does make sense. There's this professor from the Edinburgh School of Public Health that made that estimate. And it is a valid estimate, because we know already today that in conflicts, for every single individual that is killed as a direct consequence of the conflict, so whether they are shot, bombed, killed directly through military conflict, there are 15 others that will be killed or through the public health consequences, and that is access to food, healthcare, medication, anything that we have access to in a normal functioning society.
I mean, one of the points that I think you've at least sort of touched on it obliquely, but I just want to speak to here is with the destruction of medical facilities, it also seems that, perhaps things we don't even view those of us who have access to healthcare as, potentially fatal or potentially dangerous, like diarrhea or something like that can actually start to metastasize and become much more dangerous. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that too, because I think sometimes people see some of the words and they think, oh, well, that doesn't sound that bad.
Yes. So we already know that the amount of people that have been killed in Gaza are above 25,000. The people who are injured, lost under the rubble, we still don't know. We don't have a legitimate estimate on the number of these people. So I will take a regular case. Let's say somebody was close to a building that was bombed by Israeli forces. They escaped, but they have a large wound on their arm. They have to go to the hospital to get sutured. If the wound is dirty, it will have to be cleaned in the hospital. This patient will have to be on antibiotics for at least a week, and then they will have to check back in 10 days to remove their sutures. All of this is not accessible in Gaza. So the antibiotics are not there already, and this is not something new. This is something that has been reported on during the first month of the war on Gaza. Already Ghassan Abu Sitta showed us with a picture how he is cleaning wounds with white vinegar, and this is archaic medicine. This is not something that anybody willingly would subject themselves to, and no doctor would willingly prescribe their patients at all. But this is definitely something that they're being forced to do. And so definitely then the wound, if it is not cared for well enough, if it gets infected, and knowing the amount of bombing, the amount of dust that is released by this complete destruction, not just of buildings, but entire neighborhoods, and the access to clean water is absent. So definitely there will be other waterborne infections, foodborne infections, because people were forced to eat rotten food if they can even have access to it. So then the problem becomes that when we have these preventable mortalities, so we have a very simple disease that can be cured with a couple pills of antibiotics or like a simple wound treatment and then some suturing, none of this is acceptable, is fixable anymore. So then the mortality rate will increase exponentially for the most minor diseases. So even if you catch a flu today in modern society, people don't die from the flu unless they are immunocompromised, if they have other kind of diseases, or if they're very young or very old. Otherwise, people who are healthy have no reason to die from the flu or from dysentery. And this is definitely happening today in Gaza. So in that sense, Israel, despite the huge number of deaths that we haven't seen today in recent history, the true number of deaths will be projected into the future. And at that point, Israel's responsibility will be seemingly not present. They will be like, yes, but these people died. We have nothing to do with that. We did not shoot them. We did not bomb them. But they definitely made sure that all the circumstances are there for them to die from the most simple ailments.
Anis, when I had you on my show, you mentioned something about how you couldn't understand how so many Israeli doctors signed that letter, essentially saying that Gaza deserves this because it goes against everything that you're supposed to do as a doctor. And one thing you're not supposed to do, right, is do no harm. But I'm just curious, given everything you just said, I mean, you mentioned you don't have to be an expert or a doctor to recognize that this is a health disaster. What's happening internationally among various medical organizations, if anything? Is anybody releasing statements? Is anybody pressuring or talking about this in those circles on putting a stop to this, or how to address things after, the day after, as they call it, when eventually this genocide comes to a close?
As much as I think, there is power in unions to pressurize their governments towards a specific political outcome, and specifically in this case, declaring the government declaring themselves in favor of a ceasefire. Today, it doesn't really matter, especially when we have millions of people across the world protesting constantly to pressure their governments to declare themselves in favor of a ceasefire. However, there have been some declarations. One of them being in the Union of Nurses in the U.S., which is definitely something that we definitely respect, but it truly doesn't matter. As you were saying before in your previous segment, you don't always need an expert to tell you what's right and what's wrong. And even though I am a doctor and a public health specialist, it has nothing to do with the common sense. It is when you take everything away from a population, you know it's going to cause more deaths. And you don't need an Israeli doctor to tell you that this is fine. Bombing of ambulances, healthcare workers, and hospitals, and the faculty of medicine in Gaza, for you to believe them that maybe this is right. No, this is absolutely wrong. And nobody else can tell you that. And you do not need an expert to be told that. There is common sense, and common sense does work. If you feel that it is wrong, it is definitely wrong. And I think people across the world already understand that this is something that we haven't seen in around more than a century in human history. However, they also understand that this is a huge danger for everyone. The idea normalizing bombing hospitals, normalizing starving population, normalizing removing their access to any form of healthcare. This is something that people understand, because then they will project themselves into that same situation, and they will know that there will the rules of war. Even though war in itself is horrible, there are some rules to guarantee some bare minimum. And today, the bets are off. I have no idea how future conflicts will be waged after what Israel has done to the Palestinians in Gaza.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Anish Germany, Lebanese medical doctor and public health researcher, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
My pleasure.
Wow, that's really...
yeah, heavy. I mean, it really is an amazing thing. 626,000 cases of diseases in southern Gaza alone being monitored by the Palestinian Ministry of Health. 180,000 cases of respiratory infections. So very, very serious issue in terms of what's going on. And I think a very good point there made by Dr. Germany, that even if there is a ceasefire right now, many of these medical conditions, the challenges, will be ongoing, and it'll be a major aspect in the recovery as well. Well, we are going to turn our attention now to the United States of America. The electoral circus is certainly in full swing now that we had the Iowa caucuses, at least for the Republicans, this past Monday evening. Cheers to the people of Iowa who may be watching. We are very, very honored to be joined here once again by the editor of Liberation News, Walter Smolarek. Walter, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me back.
Well, great to have you back. It's in many ways the expected event took place in the Iowa caucuses this Monday for the Republicans. Donald Trump romped, I think, won almost every single county except maybe one or two. It was an expected win, I think, Walter, but what are maybe some of the things you are drawing from, where the race stands, at least now that Trump has got the first victory in the books?
Right. Well, certainly Trump is the dominant figure in the Republican Party. I mean, the only open question at this point is who's going to come in second place. I mean, who has the honor of being the closest loser to Donald Trump? Is it going to be Ron DeSantis, or is it going to be Nikki Haley?
That's a funny way to put it.
And who has sort of the best future political prospects because they were the runner-up to Donald Trump? That's really the only thing left to be determined by the primary, unless there's some truly unexpected dramatic development. It's really incredible, and I think it says just as much about Joe Biden and the Democrats as it does about the strength of Trump himself. Because Trump he's facing 4 criminal cases, right? 4 criminal trials, scores of criminal charges. He was profoundly unpopular when he left office. The policies that he pushed are profoundly unpopular, right? Even though he's considered to be like a populist, right? The hard right, extreme pro-corporate politics that he represents does not actually resonate with the bulk of the people. And so how can this billionaire former president come off as the representative of the common man against the establishment? Well, if there is anybody less pathetic in the White House than Joe Biden, he would not have such an easy time doing that. That would be actually extremely difficult for him to pull off. But because there's so much disappointment with Biden, because there's so much disgust with Biden and disgust with the Democrats, Trump is actually in a very strong position. And the criminal charges against him are actually helping, I think, because at least at this stage in the Republican primary, because of the really idiotic way that there was timed by Democratic Party politicians, actually.
Mm-hmm. Walter, It just strikes me as wild what you just reminded us of, which is how profoundly unpopular Trump was, and the fact that he's facing all these criminal charges. Yet still, if there was, an election today, according to recent polls, he would actually beat Joe Biden, and that says more about Joe Biden. I'm curious. Talk a little bit about Joe Biden in terms of what he's accomplished, because hasn't he done a lot for us? No, I'm just joking. He hasn't. But no, I mean, when you think about it, it's if Democrats were to do what they promised to do, at least some of the time, they probably would have more support for their president right now. But on top of that, you have Biden overseeing this horrific genocide in Gaza. The majority of a country wants a ceasefire. Biden keeps saying no ceasefire. We're going to keep giving weapons. I feel like this is a moment where it's really obvious to more and more people that we don't have a democracy if the person in power at the moment won't even compromise a little bit to meet people to meet what the people are demanding. Moreover, the other candidate doesn't support a ceasefire either. It's like where's the candidate who actually supports what the majority of people want?
Yeah, totally. And those two things are related, right? The total failure and disappointment on the domestic front, and disgust with his participation in the genocide against Gaza. Because when Biden came into office in the first year or so of his administration, he was actually pushing an agenda that was quite popular, right? So it would be making the child tax credit permanent, essentially monthly payments to working class parents, universal pre-K, making community college free, essentially a pretty significant expansion of social programs in the United States, which is exactly what people needed coming out of the economic devastation and physical devastation of the pandemic, right? But because of opposition from other Democrats, right, not just because of the Republicans, but because the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress for the first 2 years of the Biden administration, he did not fulfill those promises. Right, that reform agenda died, and essentially the rest of his campaign or the rest of his administration, as he moved into his reelection campaign, has been a series of excuses for why it just wasn't possible. It was just too hard to give people the basic necessities that they need to live a decent life. And maybe he can brag about an infrastructure bill that maybe people will feel the effects of in 10 years, or the quote unquote Inflation Reduction Act, which has some environmental policies, but not nearly enough to stave off climate catastrophe. So he's just basically been saying it just isn't possible because of the rules of the Senate or whatever. But then here he is, on the other hand, completely defying public opinion and sending a nonstop flow of weaponry to this apartheid regime, Israel, that's committing a genocide in Gaza, despite the fact that there's global outcry about it. I mean, clearly, in that case, for some reason, the power of the presidency is enough. Biden can do what he wants in that instance, but not in the other instance, not when it comes to actually helping working people. That disconnect, I think, is not lost on people. I think that's very, very clear to people. It's making people very rightfully angry.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly, I think that's why we are seeing some quote-unquote third-party campaigns gain momentum. Just a couple hours ago, Walter, in the United States Congress, the Senate has passed another continuing resolution. It does look like Speaker Mike Johnson will be able to get the House to deal with it very quickly. They're all moving very quickly because there's supposed to be a snowstorm this weekend. So, God forbid they can't get out of work on Thursday. That's right. In Congress, they don't really work on Friday. But that's a whole other issue. But they've passed this other continuing resolution to fund the government through March 8th, essentially. So yet again, punting on actually, funding the things that are going on with the government. How do you see this back and forth here? Obviously, there's a lot of conversation about it, but what's the scene there?
Right. I mean, another reason why this is so complicated, those only 6 days that they have in session between now and March or something like that. I mean, totally ridiculous on so many levels. Again, right, this is something that we see on an almost annual basis. The debate in Washington is not about how do we get people the things that they need. People are suffering. People are dealing with poverty. People are dealing with discrimination. People are dealing with climate catastrophe. How can we get people the resources they need? The conversation is actually about what is going to be cut. How can people get less? How can we assist people less to get by under these extremely adverse circumstances that are only getting worse? So the exact details are going to be hammered out. There is an agreement between Chuck Schumer, and Mike Johnson, the new far-right Speaker of the House, relatively new far-right Speaker of the House, about, in general, how much should be cut from each department. They'll have to say, like, okay, this program gets cut by this amount, that program gets cut by a different amount. That's really what remains to be seen, and they're essentially giving themselves a few more weeks to sort that out. Another example of the complete disconnect between what people are talking about, what working people are talking about, what working people want, and what the politicians are willing to consider. That disconnect will explode eventually. Right now, I think it's being expressed in the form of disengagement for the Democratic Party, this, abandoned Biden sentiment that, of course, is related to Palestine. But, maybe there's other people in society who want to abandon Biden, the Democrats, for other reasons or additional reasons. But I think it's going to be manifested as we get closer to Election Day in support for a lot of these progressive third-party candidates, Claudia de la Cruz and Karina Garcia being two of them. The desire for an alternative, a real radical alternative that can name the system capitalism, that can say the entire political elite, Republican or Democrat, is bought off, completely loyal to Wall Street and the big banks and the weapons manufacturers. There's a growing hunger for that because of this complete failure, this complete clown show in Congress that fails to consider what the people actually want and need.
Well, I mean, it's becoming even ever more apparent because, they can't spend any money to help people to help give people what they need. Yet they can send billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars in emergency aid for like wars in Ukraine and genocide in Gaza.
That's right. And that's another piece of this, right? There's this, they're calling it the supplementary defense spending package. It really means an additional $100 billion for war. Several different wars or potential wars, right? Maybe around 60 or 70 billion dollars for Ukraine, 14 plus billion dollars for Israel. I mean, a country that is actively currently engaged in a genocide. The Biden administration is saying we want to send them $14.3 billion so they can do that with even more intensity and ferocity. And then there's billions of dollars for Taiwan as well to move towards a war with China. The Democrats are so desperate to get this funding. And of course, a lot of Republicans are too. But the Democratic Party and Biden are so desperate to get this funding that they're willing to agree to extremely repressive anti-immigrant measures. That's what the crux of the negotiations are right now. Johnson, backed by far-right members of the House Republican caucus, are pushing for an extreme crackdown on essentially people's ability to apply for asylum, which is an internationally guaranteed human right. So in exchange for violating the fundamental human rights of immigrants and asylum seekers, of refugees, the Democrats will get the $100 billion that they want for war. This type of bargain is so, it almost defies words, how just completely craven this type of logic is, that people's rights are one, disposable in the first place, but the thing that you're going to trade that away for is more implements to kill people and to line the pockets of your donors at Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. It's completely disgusting. And yet that's, again, the terms of the debate, the terms of the negotiations that's going on right now that may actually determine whether or not the government stays open and basic services are available to people.
Yeah, amazing reality that in order to get $60 billion to Ukraine, Democrats will back immigration policies that they themselves say are the reason not to vote for Donald Trump, right? I mean, this, if you want to look it up, just look up HR2, as it were. Well, I think there's a lot that is going on these different fronts. I mean, obviously the campaign season will continue to heat up. This is maybe a slightly lighter topic, Walter, but I did want to touch on this. There is technically a Democratic primary. It's Joe Biden is there. Then there's Dean Phillips, and then there is Marianne Williamson. But Dean Phillips, of course, millionaire businessman, centrist congressperson, running exactly how you might expect a Midwestern white businessman, whatever. But anyway, just to speak to the sort of corruption of politics, Walter, there is an interesting element with him. He's trying to gain on Joe Biden here. You want to gain, you need money. And he recently made an interesting change to his campaign in exchange for money from someone who we've actually been hearing a lot about vis-a-vis the issue of the genocide in Gaza. Talk about that if you could.
Sure. Yeah. Bill Aikman, right? So he is an avowed racist. He's on a campaign to, eliminate affirmative action and diversity, equity, inclusion policies, any type of policy that a powerful institution could follow to try to address at least partially the history and reality of racist discrimination. Bill Aikman wants to get rid of that, right? And so Dean Phillips was favorable to DEI programs, right? Even if just sort of, giving it lip service because that's what you're supposed to do if you're a Democratic Party politician. He had something on his website about that. And in exchange for, correct me if I'm wrong, EJ, I believe it was $1 million, a $1 million donation from Bill Aikman, this hedge fund billionaire. He took that off of his website. Now, it wasn't like a direct quid pro quo where, you get like a receipt, like, here, thank you for your bribe, sir. But, the sequence of events that happened was Dean Phillips gets $1 million from Bill Aikman. Bill Aikman makes public comments about how he doesn't support DEI and he doesn't think Dean Phillips should either. Dean Phillips removes it from his website, right? So again, not a direct one-for-one bribe like, hello, sir, I'll give you $1 million to change your position. But I think any thinking person looking at what actually happened, I mean, it's completely clear. It's 100% clear. And it's an example of how this is actually a democracy that's up for, it's up for sale, right? It's on sale to the highest bidder. It's something that is just a sham. It's like, yes, the people, the citizens of this country get to go to the ballot box every 2 or 4 years and we get one vote. But if you have the ability to actually finance campaigns, to bankroll these politicians' lifestyles, to bankroll their day-to-day activities, your vote, your voice counts a whole lot more than anybody else's. And so the idea that this is, an egalitarian system, one in which everybody has an equal say, is complete nonsense. It's obvious on a lot of different levels. And campaign financing, right, this legalized form of bribery, unique to the U.S. political system, that's, I think, one of the most disgusting and obvious examples of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Mr. Phillips also floating a cabinet seat for Elon Musk, so he certainly knows how the system works. Walter Smolarek, you do too. You're also the editor of Liberation News, and as always, we appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Walter's so good at breaking all of it down. Breaking down the circus.
Yeah. I was going to say something else, but then I'm just going to also go on this whole issue of a circus. But yeah, here we are. Election fever is there. Very disappointing, I have to say, that Speaker Mike Johnson represents the great city of Shreveport. I'm sorry you guys have such a poor representative there in the 4th District of Louisiana. But we want to turn our attention to Sudan, where there's another very, very crucial issue going on there. Civil war continuing to rage. Nearly 7 million people displaced and much, much human suffering. And we are really honored to be joined as we continue the show by Dr. Siddique Kabalo, who is an economist and a leader in the Sudanese Communist Party. Dr. Kabalo, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it really is an honor to have you here. And I guess my first question for you here is, as the year was opening this year in 2024, it seemed like a lot of the news in Sudan was, everything is now moving towards a ceasefire, it's moving towards peace. And now it seems this week that most of that seems to be dashed. So are you seeing a continued protracted conflict here, or perhaps some of these various initiatives, so-called peace initiatives, bearing some fruit?
Well, I think what you said, signs of peace at the end of the year, were false signs. When I left Khartoum, I was in the war zone for 7 months. I left Khartoum on the 16th of November. War is continuing as ever, and it is spreading too. After I left, they advanced in another 2 states in Sudan. I mean, the Rapid Support Forces, the militia. The army is not showing real resistance. So both fighting forces are not for peace. They are fighting despite all these talks. And I think the international, what is called the international organizations like the UN and so, as if they are enjoying this. To say from time to time they are working and counting the victims, uh, uh, ex- uh, speaking about the probability of uh, hunger or famine, of children malnutrition, all this. While the cause of this is a war, and there is nothing done to stop the war, but all the attempts to pass a resolution in the Security Council were not successful. They were not successful. And uh, telling the fighting groups to stop the war without real pressure um, is not enough. Anyhow, we, in our part, we are trying to reorganize the Sudanese people. The problem is that this war from the two sides is compelling the Sudanese people to run away in exile or as displaced. And this makes their organization very difficult. Their effect on the pressure on land very small, and hence increase the necessity of international solidarity. With the world now having the Red Sea war, the Gaza Israeli, or the Israeli attack on Gaza, inhuman attack in Gaza, and the war in Russia and Ukraine, and all this, no international intention is given to this poor country, although they are competing in the resources of this country and allowing their puppets like the Emirate country, the to some extent the Egyptian government, the Saudis, to Chadians, Southern Sudanese, to interfere in the war by different ways. Some supporting the army, others supporting the rapid support forces, and this making life difficult. I stayed for 7 months there, and in the area, in Khartoum itself, that is Khartoum North, for 7 months, there is no water, no electricity. We were lucky that we are on the side of the Nile, so we can get water from the Nile by buckets, and so on. Other people are far from the Nile, and they are having difficulties of having water. And the army is using the airplanes to pump, and wrongly or rightly pumping civilians. The rapid RSF, the rapid support forces, are shelling the areas. They might have attempted to shell the army, but instead the shelled are the civilian people. Plus, that there are attacks on the houses. They take the belongings of the citizens, their cars, their money, even sometimes their food. So it is a difficult situation. And all these long speeches about humanitarian aid, I haven't seen it for 7 months in Khartoum. So where it has gone? If it is arriving Khartoum, if it's arriving Port Sudan, for example, where the government is placed here, the self-appointed government, where this aid is going. No medicine. The main 3 hospitals of the capital Khartoum, which are established at the beginning of the 20th century, when colonialism was there, are closed. There are only small hospitals working under siege of the army and the support forces. One completely in Khartoum North is monopolized by the rapid support forces, their wounded personnel, and so on. And the one in northern Omdurman is monopolized by the army. And so they are both targets for attacks from the other side. Doctors are not allowed. Of course, speaking about schools, about any other activity is just an imagination, nothing there. The children are losing the this year of education completely, and people are now in Egypt, Ethiopia, Uganda, Chad as refugees, and the displaced are facing a strange situation where they run to a state and the rapid support forces come to that state, so they run to another. And they are on the run all the time. And people are dying either of the war because they are bombed by the army or shelled by the rapid armed forces. But there is increasing death of heart attacks, not among the settled Sudanese only who stayed in the war area, but for those who are refugees, especially in Egypt. Every day and another, there is a person died with heart attack. And those, some of them are the intellectuals, the writers, the singers, the musicians. This war also destroys the museums. And now there is the danger that a historical area, southern or eastern of Shindi, is under attack by the rapid speed forces and bombing from the army. So all this history is between warring fight. Sudan is not just having his population driven out, his revolutionary forces driven out, his assets destroyed. Factories, bridges, schools, hospitals, government building, company building. Khartoum became now as a shadow of a town.
It's horrible. That's just horrible. Hearing that level of destruction is just horrific. And it's, now as you said, there's not really any peace talks in sight. I'm just curious if you could put this in the context of, you're saying, okay, we have these two powers vying, or we have these two groups vying for power. They're fighting a war. But who benefits from this continuing? Because when it comes to war, someone's always benefiting, right?
Well, yes. The army, for some reasons, is under the influence of the Islamist of the old regime. And those want to return to power to defend their interest, which the revolution of 2018 really put them in danger. The rapid support forces were also made up by the Islamists, but they made their own investment some of it with partnership with Wagner forces, or the Russian Wagner forces, and some with the Emirates, and so on. So they have their direct interest. But the area itself is a struggle between the Russian and Chinese on one side and the Americans and the West on the other side, especially this long coast of the Red Sea. And the one of the richest countries now of gold and other metals, including the furious uranium. You know, when there is uranium, there is conflict.
Yep.
More than the war, because it is not just wealth, it is power. So Sudan has uranium in the southwest, in the northwest, and has petroleum, has gold, has other metals, including iron, magnesium, whatever. Whatever metal you can speak of is there. And it is still not tapped. Whatever is exploited of the oil is only small percentage. Whatever is exploited of the gold is only, others are not tapped at all. So it is there for the struggle. We are now as if back to the years for gambling for Africa. Now they are gambling in Africa for Sudan. And that is why some states is looking, let them fight. Both will be weak, and the revolutionary will be sent abroad and weaken itself, and then that Sudan will become ours. And this is a inhuman strategy. If this war happened in any other place, the United Nations Security Council would have by now issued 100 resolution and might have ordered the Sudan to be put under Chapter 7. But it is left for the United States and Saudi Arabia to mediate. To the African Union, which is very weak itself, and the IGAD, which is established for different purposes. To establish to develop this Horn of Africa, stand against desertification and all these things, now become a political arm of some Western countries to control this and that. That is why we are nowhere. And at the end, as usual in the history of the Sudanese people themselves take their destiny and decide for themselves. That will be costly, but it seems it is the only future possible now with the current situation in Sudan. Today, the IGAD had a meeting in Uganda for that. It has some points about Sudan and calling on the leaders of the post-fighting groups to meet within 14 days. No one knows what happens if they didn't meet within 14 days, or whether they meet within 14 days and did not reach any agreement. So no real pressure is there. No international or regional pressure. As for the Arab League, as if Sudan is not part of that country. And they are supporting one side of the war. They are supporting the army. So, and the Sudanese people are killed. You said 7 million are displaced. I think the number is more than that. Very much more than that, because it is now 4 states in the west, Khartoum, plus 2 states in the center, White Nile and Jazeera, and the war is going towards the east. So the displaced people are more than that. The one of my colleague, an economist, estimated the loss of the war as $120 billion.
Wow.
That is more than the debt of the Sudan, almost twice the debt of the Sudan, which in reality, dealing with that debt was one of the problems of the revolution. They are pressing the transitional government to reschedule the debt or deal with it otherwise, under condition they accept all the IMF and the World Bank conditions. And this lessened the support of the transitional government and made it possible for the army to make its coup on the 25th of October 221. And that coup was the first coup in the history of the Sudan to be faced by opposition on the first hours before the statement of the coup was made. And they failed even to make a real government until now. They revised most of the decision of the transitional period about transforming the state or confiscating the wealth of the leaders of the Islamic Front and so on. And even the coup was not faced with an opposition from what is called the international community. They were opening venues, speaking for peaceful transitional yet, and so. So that is the situation. I lived in it. I suffered from it. My house was attacked 13 times by the rabid support forces. My belongings were taken. I was compelled to go abroad on the 16th of November because I was so ill. I have to seek. But I'm here again and speaking to you about the situation.
Well, we really appreciate you being willing to join us, Doctor, and we are very glad that you are safe. And there's a lot to sort through here. We'll have to bring you back as the conflict continues, but we really appreciate you, Dr. Sidki Kabalo, who's an economist, also a Sudanese Communist Party leader. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thank you.
Well, we went around the world today, literally.
We sure did.
Yeah, we missed like a couple continents, but we got a few of them.
We'll get to them. Latin America, sorry. We'll get to you next week, perhaps.
Yes.
Still a lot of things going on there, especially in the country of Ecuador. But that will bring us to the end of our show here today.
Since we're in person, should we high five or something?
I don't think we should high five,
Come on, he's gonna leave me hanging.
Jesus.
We should get like a gif of us high fiving.
Please delete that.
I'm definitely gonna make it my avatar.
Well, is there anything?
My new profile photo is me and Eugene high fiving.
Is there anything relevant that you want to leave on?
You don't think our high five is relevant? That was like epic, but okay.
No, it's personal. It's between us. It's not for the viewers.
So yes, of course, thank you everybody who tuned in, and you can become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, get access to exclusive content, help support this program as well as all of our other excellent journalism coming from so many different spaces in Breakthrough News. And yeah, I really encourage you, if you are able to help support the show.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, big thanks to everybody involved in any sort of way. Big thanks to everyone who's supporting us in any sort of way. Very, very happy to be able to bring you this show going into the new year. We'll be back with you on the Freedom Side next week. So for all of us here on the Breakthrough News team, see you next time.
Everything that gets